Aloha, everyone, and welcome back.
Aloha.
Today we are taking a deep dive into, well, Tiki history and facts.
Yeah.
And we're going to be focusing in on a particular spot that you guys have been sending to us quite a bit.
Oh, really?
Casper, Wyoming. You familiar with Casper?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, in a general sense,
Mm-hmm.
I've heard of it, of course.
Yeah.
But I don't know that I could place it on a map.
Okay, well, we're going to talk about Casper, Wyoming, because in Casper, Wyoming, there was this, it called itself Wyoming's first Polynesian lounge.
Oh, wow.
Called the Reef Lounge.
The Reef Lounge. Okay.
Does that sound familiar?
No, it doesn't. But I have to say, it has my interest piqued.
It's a very interesting spot and a very interesting story, and it's a story that starts out so promising.
Okay.
You know, when you think about like post-World War II America, there was this huge wave of fascination with Polynesian culture.
Sure.
Right? So all of a sudden you had these tiki lounges popping up all over the place,
Right.
promising you this exotic escape from the everyday. So that's kind of the scene that we're setting here, is that like mid-century America and this rise of a tiki lounge, and it's hitting Wyoming of all places.
It's that classic allure of the faraway and the romantic, isn't it?
Totally.
Palm trees swaying, cocktails with little umbrellas in them, a complete fantasy world, kind of in contrast to the realities of the time.
Yeah.
And to find that right in the heart of Wyoming, well, it certainly piques the curiosity.
Yes. The Reef Lounge, when it opened its doors in 1961, it proudly declared itself Wyoming's first Polynesian lounge.
Wow.
And from what we've uncovered, this wasn't just like some half-hearted attempt at like sticking a couple of bamboo poles up and calling it a day. You know, the details really paint a picture of a very carefully crafted, immersive experience.
What's fascinating to me here, though, is the very location. You mentioned 101S Center Street.
Right.
Now, before it became this Polynesian oasis, this was Karshan's Children's Corner.
What?
Yeah, that's quite a transformation, wouldn't you say?
From a place filled with toys and children's laughter to one promising, these potent drinks and kind of the mystery of all these carved idols and stuff.
Right.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. And even the design of the reef is where it gets even more interesting, because we uncovered that it was the brainchild of this husband and wife decorating team from Palm Springs, California, Lou and Cliff Sawyer.
Palm Springs. Oh, okay. So this is very deliberate.
Very deliberate.
Okay.
They were specialists in creating these kinds of tiki environments.
Yeah. I mean, Palm Springs really was a center for that whole aesthetic, wasn't it, in the mid-century?
Totally.
And the Sawyers had a notable portfolio. I mean, they were behind the South Pacific Room and the Beachcomber shops, both in Palm Springs, of course, and even further afield up in Anchorage, Alaska. They designed the South Sea Club and the Surf Room restaurant.
Really?
Yeah. So, I mean, the Reef wasn't some standalone oddity. It was very much of its time and part of a recognized design trend.
And so they really had a vision, it seems like. And looking at the newspaper article from the Casper Tribune, Herald and Star on September 3rd, 1961, you get a sense of what that vision was.
Okay.
For the Reef.
Okay.
So the entrance on Center Street, it featured these two prominent picture windows.
Oh, okay. So right from the street, you're getting a sense of it.
Yeah, and the description of the tiki figures in these windows, I mean, it was not subtle.
Okay.
A 5-foot tiki god surrounded by jungle flowers and seashells in one window.
My goodness.
And then in the other, this 8-foot tiki god.
Wow.
So they're making a statement from the sidewalk. You know, this is not just a bar.
It's a portal.
It's a portal.
You're stepping into a different world.
Right. And then they had this detail that I love about the shelf above the door.
Okay.
It was filled with rocks from Wyoming rock beds that were collected by local rock clubs.
Oh, so there's this local element as well.
Yeah, it's like you're in this exotic world.
Right.
But we're still in Wyoming.
Yeah.
We haven't forgotten where we are.
I haven't forgotten our roots.
Right, exactly. And the initial owners and operators of the Reef were all local guys too, Bill and Keith Asbell and Bill Markham.
Oh, okay.
So it was really like a local enterprise with this wonderfully escapist theme.
And it didn't even stop there, right? Because about a year later, they added the Surf Room.
Oh, tell me about that.
Yeah, this was a complimentary restaurant, which was advertised in the Casper Morning Star in September 1962.
Wow.
So you could enjoy those Polynesian cocktails and then move on to a full meal without having to leave this really carefully constructed, immersive environment.
I love that.
They were really committed to it.
They were committed.
It makes you wonder just how successful it was.
Well, I mean, from what we gather, it sounds like for a time, the reef was the place to be in Casper,
Yeah.
this classy, exotic escape. The articles talk about it as a palace of Polynesian fantasy,
Right.
where you could get flavorful drinks. They talk about steaks. They had good food, too.
Right.
So there was this real draw, I think, this promise of something completely different than you would find in Wyoming.
And that's the key, isn't it? Because, I mean, Casper, Wyoming is probably not the first place that springs to mind when you think about a thriving tiki scene, you know?
Not really, no.
So this really did offer something different, this unique kind of escapism,
Yeah.
a chance to leave behind the everyday world
Yeah.
and immerse yourself in this very carefully, crafted fantasy world.
Yeah. And, as we move from the 60s into the 70s, we start to see things change a little bit. The times are changing.
Sure.
And we found out that in the late 1960s, the original owners sold the reef
Oh, really?
to two local athletes, Don Humberson and Ray Mora.
Okay.
And Ray Mora in particular had quite the profile in Casper.
He did a real local figure. I mean, he was a Natrona County high school football star,
Yeah.
Golden Gloves boxing champ, even coached Oilers midget football.
Wow.
And then after 11 years as a mail carrier, he managed the Tomahawk Room at the Townsend Hotel.
Yeah.
So,
So he was well known.
very much a well-known and respected member of the community, it seems.
Yeah. How does someone with that background end up owning a tiki lounge?
That's a good question.
It's a very interesting kind of, career trajectory.
Yeah.
But there was definitely optimism with this new ownership.
Okay.
A 1975 Star Tribune article mentions Mora talking about planning a burn the mortgage party, expecting to have it paid off before the end of the year.
Oh, wow.
So it sounds like things are going reasonably well,
Yeah.
at least for a time.
It speaks to success, doesn't it?
It does.
A couple of local athletes taking on this, already established exotic venue.
Right, and becoming very successful with it.
Yeah, but I'm curious about that same article you mentioned, that it kind of hints at a change in the overall atmosphere of downtown Casper, right?
Yes.
It says that the quote-unquote glitz was giving way to quote-unquote grit.
Right, yeah.
Were there any specific, economic or social factors mentioned that might have contributed to this change, and how might that have impacted a place like the Reef?
They don't really go into great detail about wider changes that are going on in Casper at the time, but it's definitely something to consider. But we do start to see some signs of this changing atmosphere affecting the reef itself.
Okay.
There's this newspaper account from January 1973 where Ray Mora was assaulted with a knife by an angry patron.
Oh, my goodness.
He wasn't seriously injured, thankfully, but it does suggest a slightly different kind of environment
Right.
than in its early days, perhaps a more volatile clientele.
Yeah, that's a big contrast to that initial image of, the classy Polynesian escape, isn't it?
It is.
If there's, this real-world tension starting to intrude on the fantasy a little bit.
Yeah, and sadly, this is where our story takes a very dark turn, a turn that ultimately leads to the demise of the reef. Yeah, July 16th, 1975. This is the date when everything changes.
Okay.
We have details of an incident involving a man named James Peterson.
Okay.
He was a construction superintendent from Pennsylvania who was in Glen Rock for work on a new smokestack.
Okay.
Now, that particular evening, he had been drinking quite a bit. He had been drinking with some coworkers in Glen Rock, and then when they left to go to the airport, he continued drinking at their motel in Casper, alone.
Okay.
And then he decided to go downtown to the reef.
Okay.
So he goes to the roof, and according to all the reports, he racks up a huge bar tab.
Oh, wow.
He's buying drinks for himself and lots of other people at the bar.
Okay.
And this leads to a dispute over the bill, as you might imagine.
Yeah.
And witnesses report that it escalated to the point where Peterson actually threw a drink at the bartender.
Oh, no.
So he's given a refund, and he's asked to leave.
Okay.
So he leaves the reef,
Okay.
but that is not the end of the night for him.
Oh.
He then goes to another bar
Oh, no.
called the Tomahawk Lounge
Okay.
for more drinks.
Okay.
And then for reasons that are unclear, he decides to go back to the reef
Okay.
to reportedly make amends,
Cleaning amends.
which is when he encounters Ray Mora again.
Okay.
Now, having experienced trouble with people in his bar before,
Right.
remember the assault? Mora's reaction this time was to grab a can of Halt animal repellent. Have you ever heard of that?
Oh.
It was this very strong irritant spray that was designed to deter animals.
Okay.
And he sprayed Peterson in the face with it.
Oh, my goodness.
Now I can only imagine
Yeah.
how disorienting and painful that would be.
Of course.
So Peterson runs outside,
Okay.
but Mora pursues him and continues to spray him.
Oh, no.
This confrontation spills out into the street.
Okay.
Mora repeatedly using this repellent on him and even kicking him
My goodness.
after he falls down.
So this is a really disturbing scene.
Very disturbing.
And it just keeps escalating.
And it does.
So what happens next?
Peterson eventually makes his way to the Branding Iron Cafe,
Okay.
requests a taxi,
Okay.
and then goes back out to the street.
Okay.
So you would think at that point that would be the end of it,
Right.
A really ugly encounter, but non-fatal.
Right.
But it wasn't.
Okay.
Peterson, now seemingly consumed by rage, gets into that taxi and goes back to his motel, retrieves a revolver, and then returns to the Reef, telling the taxi driver to wait for him.
Oh, my goodness. So this is a very deliberate escalation.
Yeah, and the confrontation inside the Reef is swift and devastating.
Okay.
Peterson storms in Mora, anticipating further trouble, is hiding behind some tiki beads near the jukebox.
Oh, wow.
And he sprays the repellent at Peterson one last time.
Oh, my goodness.
Peterson fires his weapon, shooting Ray Mora in the head, killing him instantly.
What a horrific climax to this story.
I know, and then Peterson flees in his truck after the taxi driver, who had already called the police, understandably leaves the scene, and he's apprehended a short time later.
Wow.
Yeah, so Peterson was charged with first-degree murder, and the trial had to be moved to Cheyenne because of all the local interest in the case.
Yeah.
The first trial actually resulted in a hung jury.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because the defense argued that Peterson was too intoxicated to have formed the specific intent required for a murder conviction.
Oh, so they were saying he didn't mean to kill him.
Right, they said he meant to scare him.
Okay.
But in May 1977, the second trial reaches a different conclusion.
Okay.
Peterson is found guilty and sentenced to 20 to 21 years in prison.
Wow.
The Star Tribune reports from the time say that he showed no emotion as the sentence was read.
My goodness.
And on the 5th anniversary of Ray Mora's death, July 16th, 1980, his family publishes a memorial to him in the Casper Star Tribune.
That's heartbreaking.
It is, and it's a really definitive end to the story of Ray Mora, and in many ways to the story of the Reef itself.
Right.
The lounge was sold and reopened in 1978 under the new name The Wine Cellar.
Okay.
And it went through a couple of more iterations after that. There was a disco hall called the Soundstage, and then a restaurant called the Wine Rack. But by 1986, the building at 101 S Center was no longer listed in business directories.
Wow. And so where this, Polynesian Fantasy once stood is now the first interstate bank plaza, a complete transformation.
A very different vibe.
Right, from this vibrant themed space to, a very everyday sort of institution, a place that people go to, take care of their finances.
Right.
The symbol of the everyday world that it once tried to help people forget.
It's really quite a story, isn't it?
It is. We've gone from, the excitement of this new venture to this really tragic ending.
We started out talking about this Polynesian paradise, this escape.
Yeah.
And we ended up talking about a murder.
It's a stark reminder, isn't it, of how the unexpected can really shatter our illusions.
It is.
A place built on escapism and fantasy became the backdrop for this very real event.
It really did.
What does it tell us about that fragile line between our idealized worlds and the realities of life?
That's a really good question, one that I think is worth pondering.
Aye.
I hope this deep dive has given you a richer understanding of this really unique piece of Casper history.
Me too.
And maybe you'll even look up some images of these mid-century tiki lounges.
Oh, yeah?
And imagine what the Reef was like in its heyday, before that fateful night.
Until next time, aloha.
Aloha. Bye.